Whosoever will be saved, before all things it is necessary that he hold the Catholic faith.
Welcome to Veritas et Fus, or Truth and Incense, a podcast of the one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church, the faith and the liturgy, which is the public expression of that faith, especially as seen through the Anglican heritage. My normal partner in crime is away this episode. He is doing pastoral work, but I have with me again Father Greg Peters, who is a teacher at Biola University, sometimes teacher at Nashotah Theological Seminary, but he has a long history in monasticism, monastic spirituality, has written two books, neither of which I have in front of me right now. One is The Monkhood of All Believers, and one is a recent one called Anglican Spirituality, both of which are very good. But I want to take a few minutes here and talk about, how does this work? What is the practical application of this kind of spirituality in to your average Christian? And I think there's a richness to it, but oftentimes I don't think people appreciate or understand how to apply this kind of spirituality. I want to get into both of our backgrounds and talk about kind of how we came into this spirituality. But I want to begin, Father, if you wouldn't mind. I'm going to kind of ask you a tough question to get started. If someone walked up to you and said, monastic spirituality, okay, what does that mean? How do I use it? How would you answer?
Wow. Yeah, actually, that is, I actually think that is a tough question, because over the years, we've used a lot of adjectives in front of the word spirituality. Christians, and of course you can also talk about Buddhist spirituality, but we talk about like Franciscan spirituality, Augustinian spirituality, those kinds of things. And I mean, at the end of the day, I guess the first thing I would say is like, mostly I like to think that all spirituality is just Christian spirituality, but we know there were practices and things unique to the monastery, and hence, like the kind of spirituality that would come out of that context versus a domestic context, non-monastic domestic context. So I would say monastic spirituality is that way of talking about living the Christian life that prioritizes certain realities for the monk. And I would say something like living in community, which would include obedience to an abbot or an abbess, and of course community implies a group of confreres, so you're not alone, in other words, or at least not you're alone in the sense of a monk is one who's alone and single-mindedly focused on God, but not truly alone in the community, and also living under a ruled life, so that there are actual requirements laid upon you, and not everything is just kind of subjectively decided what might be best for me. For example, like if the community fasts communally, then you are going to fast communally on that day, perhaps versus a non-monastic Christian who can who can kind of discern for themselves if they should when and how in fasting. So again, like monastic spirituality is that form of the spiritual life that comes out of the context of men and women who live together in a community under a particular rule of life.
Do you think it's necessary to have that experience to be able to appreciate and apply monastic spirituality?
Yeah, well, yes and no. So, most Christians live under a rule implicitly anyway. And so the first one we would live under is the scriptures. And even if we don't think of it as a rule, the word canon, the canon of scriptures is already a rule. That's what a canon is, So obviously, like, prayer is not really an option in the Christian spiritual life, or it's not supposed to be. You're not supposed to discern whether or not I, as a Christian, should pray. The scriptures say, pray without ceasing when you pray. So prayer is already a rule. So we kind of already live under a ruled form of life. And then none of us truly exist in isolation from other people, right? So the unmarried single person does not live in isolation from other people. So we do live in forms of community that probably aren't overly top down. or
Mhm.
like a monastic community is, the abbot or the abbess. That's
Right.
a top down structure. Most of us maybe don't live in those communities, but we do live in community. So we have kind of what we might think of as like proto monastic experiences, if you will, or kind of quasi monastic experience. And so I don't think we're starting completely from scratch, but I think to really benefit from monastic spirituality, I'm sure we'll get into this, then you do have to up the ante a little bit about the community that you live in and your
Yeah.
commitment to it, and your responsibility within it, and the intentionalization of a ruled life.
Right. I was thinking you mentioned about the idea of a rule or a structure and such, and in some ways, I think the church year can almost
Mm,
supply some of that, following the liturgical year and such, and getting into the, obviously, if you get into the reading of the Book of Common Prayer, you have the Psalms and you have readings from the Scriptures that are appropriate to that. But you also have just the Eucharist, and you have, the Sunday readings, and also which are going to allow you to enter into something into that mystery.
mm.
Now, I want to talk a little bit about both of our backgrounds and kind of where you were and what that taught you, and how that has helped you to appreciate monastic spirituality. So would you go into your background just a little bit?
Absolutely. So very clearly, I was not raised in a monastic context. I was raised as a Southern Baptist in Virginia. So I should just state that at the very beginning. I couldn't have told you what the word monk even meant probably when I was 20 years old, but it was about that age when I was taking a class in college. I went to a small Bible college, and it was church history. And the professor talked about a Cistercian monk, Bernard of Clairvaux, and I was like, I mean, really, I'm not trying to overstate it. I'm really am just kind of a Southern kid from Central Virginia, whose dad worked at a paper mill and whose mom was a nurse. I was like, what's a monk? I don't know what a monk is, much less a Cistercian. I probably couldn't even spell it back then. And, this is kind of, I don't know, the internet's a thing, but no one has it. We can't access it yet. And so you go and get a book and you're like, what's a monk? So I started just discovering what is a monk, and discovering the history of monks and how ubiquitous they are in the history of the church, even if not they weren't, in my church experience. And so I thought, wow, I just kind of fell in love with monasticism as a movement of the spirit in the life of the church. And before I knew it, I, like was reading Bernard, doing more studies in monasticism, and thought, well, I've kind of wanted to do a PhD. I wonder if I could do something in this area. And that's what I decided to do. So then I discovered that you could go to Minnesota and study with monks at St. John's School of Theology. Not the only place in the U.S., but one of the only places in the U.S. to go and study with monks. And St. John's at the time had a really robust monastic studies program, especially lots of monks and nuns from other communities coming there to study. And then in the summer, even more monks and nuns coming for like the great summer sessions. And so here I went, as the Baptist that I was, I moved to Minnesota to study with monks and nuns. And I had met real monks and nuns prior to that, becoming a friend of the now deceased and former abbot of Our Lady of Dallas Cistercian Monastery, Dennis Farkasvalvi. But then I was up there kind of worshiping with, studying with monks, and just kept that trajectory going, wrote a PhD thesis in Toronto on a 12th century Greek monk named Peter of Damascus. And the whole time, not only am I studying the monks, but I'm getting to know monks. I'm spending more and more time at monasteries, both for retreats and just because, I have friends at them. And so I get invited. Maybe the final piece is just to say, like, I've never lived in a monastic community, but in about 10 years ago or so, I got invited to do the Doctorate of Monastic Studies degree at Sant Anselmo's in Rome, which is the pontifical, university that's historically Benedictine. It's not just Benedictines, but that's their house of studies. And it's a pontifical degree, and so I was honored to be asked, and so I went ahead and wrote a thesis, which actually became the Monkhood of All Believers book that you referenced. That was my thesis there, and defended it and got that degree. So I guess that's just a way of saying, like, I'm pretty much all in on monastic things, and up to and including having a degree literally in monastic studies from a Roman school. So
Well, so how did you go from when did you leave Southern Baptists and go to and become Anglican, or what was your denominational journey in that regard?
Yeah, really from Baptist to Anglican. I just biblically read myself out of being a Baptist. I developed from the scriptures a sacramental theology, John chapter 6, 1 Corinthians 10 and 11. And also started craving a creedal expression of the faith, and just came to see that Episcopal church structure seemed to be what Paul was talking about in the pastorals. And so so it's when my wife and I moved here almost 20 years ago, it we had to find a new church, and so it opened the door for us to think about becoming Anglicans, and so we did. And then I was ordained like 4 years later, so I've been ordained about 15 years. But yeah, so that was the monastic studies. I guess you could say maybe were part of it, primarily because they were exposing me very deeply to the history of the church, and to the primary text in the church's tradition. But my reason for becoming Anglican was, like I said, sacramental theology, creedal, and Episcopal church structure. Yeah.
Right. Interesting. My background, just very quickly for those who are watching, is I was raised Episcopal, and at one point the Episcopal Church was just going too crazy. Although I'd already begun to hear about the people like Francis of Assisi and Bernard of Clairvaux and such, and I went over and I ended up finding the Latin Mass movement, and that I read more about that, found the rule of Saint Benedict, and I was a Benedictine for a few years. Left that. It was kind of a foundation, and it was a lot of work, but beautiful. Went off, and there was in America. Went to France, and I was a Dominican for a time, and then I went to the Grand Chartreuse and spent some time there also, which was a wonderful experience, and I've very much enjoyed it. But I also realized I wasn't meant to live that life as much as I appreciated it, and I think that this is kind of what I want to, people who come to you and say, "Oh, monastic spirituality, what does that mean?" You can't tell them. How do you, pass on to them the experience of what it is? I think it's a discipline. You learn to pray while you work, and if you go in the church in the morning and they sing the psalms and there are readings and such, and then you go to work, and during the day you muse, because again there's silence generally, well, generally always, but I mean, there's silence, so but I mean, you're busy, but while you're busy you're able to muse over and think about, and they teach you how to think and pray over what you've read. So you're not necessarily reciting the rosary or the Jesus prayer, you're meditating on what you've read. um what how do you um how do you take these kind of the monastic experience you went through, the time that you spent, and how does it form your daily life?
Yeah. Yeah, it's a great question, because I mean, I think you know this because you've lived the life, but like when you go to join a monastery, it's all in. I mean, the closest experience I've had to that kind of all in is when I went to boot camp for the Navy. And like you're all dressed alike, doing the same things all the time with a clear leadership structure and rules. It really is kind of a quasi monastic existence in boot camp. But when you're a monk, you're all in. It's what you do. It's like what you say. I mean, you're in there in the church in the morning, both probably because the rule requires it and because that's the telos of your life, is to be in that space doing those things. And the challenge for non-monastics or non-traditional monastics, like myself or anyone for that matter, probably watching this podcast, is our days are like carte blanche to some extent, right? We probably have a job we have to go to, and depending on the kind of employment we have, there might be work we're told to do, but we also might have a lot of freedom in what we choose to do. And if we have a family, we probably have certain commitments that like, hey, like I can't pick up our son from middle school today, you've got to do it, or whatever, there's basketball practice tonight. So before you know it, a lot of things have kind of crowded in into your life, and not all of those were necessarily by immediate choice, if you will. But I think what the thing with monastic spirituality is, it's basically like that. I think it takes the false distinction between the secular and the sacred, and it basically says that there is no distinction like that. Really, everything is sacred. And we'd be well served, I think, to learn that from the monastics, that washing dishes is a holy act, and serving others is a holy act. And I think that's one of the main things, the challenge for lay people, non-monastic lay people and priests, is to say, like, well, how do I consecrate all of this to the Lord in a way that is not superficial, but meaningful and truly an act of consecration. And so part of that is learning, from the monks that you pray, but you never, the formal prayer time might end, but you continue to pray, you continue to ruminate on the lessons, on the text, on the prayers. You carry that with you throughout the day, and no matter what you're doing, that the word is always just there, at the surface. And so I think monastic spirituality can just be so valuable to kind of shatter a little bit of this, like, well, now I have to go off and do my, secular work, or my, non-spiritual church thing. And then, now it's Sunday or whatever, so it's church time. But like, to think of it instead, like, no, all of life is sacred. And I think this is being Anglicans, I mean, this is part of the great thing. The prayer book is inspired by the monastic tradition. And so if you live into the prayer book, if you're doing the daily offices, right, keeping the church year, observing, saints' days, like, what a great day to be talking about monasticism on the feast of St. Anthony.
There you are.
But yeah, when you do those things, you're already kind of monasticizing your life to some extent. And then, like monks who don't stay in the chapel all day, but have to go do that work, how do you take that, the chapel prayer, and make that just part of the rest of your work that you're going to do? And, that's not unique to monks. That's a challenge that we all have. And monks just have can be a great model for us in that, because again, they, when that is what you are called to do, then you really can speak to that in ways that those who aren't called to that exact same thing can really benefit, from hearing, and again, I like anyone who might go into studying monasticism, I had a very rosy idea of what that was, a very inaccurate idea of what that was. And then the more real monks I met, the more time I spent at monasteries, I was like, oh yeah, like these monks don't always like the things they have to do, like they too are having to struggle to remind themselves that all these things are sacred and consecrated to God. So, it's incredibly humbling to realize that, monks can be a model, but they're also just fellow pilgrims in all of these,
human as well.
All of these things. Yeah.
So I want to touch on a word that you used a minute or two ago, and the word is ruminate. And there's actually a structure behind and rules behind ruminating, which is generally called the ladder of monks. And there's the 4 steps. Will you go through those steps on the reading, meditating, and praying?
Yeah, absolutely. So Lectio, I mean, it works out beautifully in Latin, as you know. Lectio, reading, where you literally take the text of the scriptures or other spiritual texts, and you read them. And by reading them, you're not reading just for gaining information necessarily, but you're reading them attending to the words, the choice of words, the relationship of the words. And then you meditate on those words. So meditatio would be the next step. And that's really part of the ruminatio there, I think, is that's where you ruminate on what you've been reading. And of course, that, as you know, in the medieval period, like the monks would talk about, it's like chewing the cud. Mm-hmm. You regurgitate it and think through it again and swallow it and then regurgitate it and do it again. So that kind of rumination, over words or words that you read. And then I like the way, I can't remember exactly who said this, maybe it was Michael Casey or someone said, and when you meditate, you come very quickly to realize that your insufficiency and unworthiness. So it forces you into oratio, to prayer. But again, not just prayer like, oh, Lord, help me, I'm a terrible person, but prayer in the sense of like, Lord, help me live according to what I've been ruminating on or seeing in the scriptures. Help me to, it could be praise, petition.
Help me to understand what's in this. What secrets are hiding, or what
exactly.
light can I...
Yeah. I mean, the scriptures, that reading is like a light, and the ruminating is like, where is the light shining? And then the prayer is to, when you see what it's shining on, to take that before the Lord. And then The fourth rung, contemplatio, contemplation, and this is the one that mostly in the monastic tradition would say something like contemplation's a gift of God. You can't force contemplation to happen, right? You can't always take that final step onto the fourth rung. It's kind of like Bernard of Clairvaux's fourth degree of love. That's a gift given to you, and others might mitigate that a little bit and say, no, contemplation is then you take all of that reading, meditating, and praying, and you direct it very Godward. That's a kind of contemplation. Either or is fine with me, but that step of where the end of the process is not about you. It's the end of the process actually is God, which it was always the end. The reading was also for the end of God.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah.
I think oftentimes contemplation, people expect very lofty, very like some sort of like rapture or being taken out of oneself. And I think that a lot of times contemplation is it's the fruit. It's like when you get an insight or you see, I think the Psalms do this to me all the time, but even some of the Old Testament and various places, and you read along, you're like, oh, that's interesting. I hadn't thought about that before. Or give insight into human nature and insight into sin and temptation, or any of these things. And what God gives you little insights. I don't think necessarily. I mean, you can have great contemplation, and there are those who do. I had at this point. So, but I have many times have had better understandings of the nature of the relationship between God and the soul, better understanding of how prayer works, how sin and temptation works, things like that. Or even how to deal with my neighbor. And you read through these things and you see, okay, I see how someone else dealt with a situation. Boy, I all of a sudden I can relate better. So I think a lot of it is it can be practical meditation or practical fruit as well as just heavenly.
Yeah, I agree, and I think if one is given that rapture, if you will, right, granted by God some sort of ecstatic experience, thanks be to God. But that we can't let that alone be the way we think about contemplation, because contemplation is the ability to like you say, sit with God and come to see the world in the way God sees the world, and to understand everything. What is it? The rule of Benedict, to understand everything in like a single ray of light, or the life of Benedict from Gregory. Beautiful way of thinking about like that. That really is what contemplation is, when my thoughts are consistent with God's thoughts, if you will. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. I want to talk a minute about, and I don't want to spend too long on this, but I was just thinking as you were talking there about the attitude toward reading, the attitude toward prayer. I know that people do this oftentimes. They'll. I think the idea of going in there, and this goes kind of into your oratio part, is that when you read something there, to approach the scriptures with I always go back. There's a phrase in the Anglican liturgy, which unfortunately is escaping me right now, but it goes into with meek heart and due reverence. So going in there and looking at the text, and is there an attitude, or is there a way that you approach? You read the morning office. Is there a way? Is there kind of a prepare yourself attitude, or a kind of a way that you look at the readings that helps you with prayer?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I don't. I mean, I know how I make a living, but being a professor, primarily is like I kind of make a living at reading, if you will, teaching. So I read a lot because I get paid to do it. So, but when it comes to the morning office, I mean, I'm not reading that like I'm reading. I mean, even a good fiction book, Dostoevsky or something like that. Nor am I certainly reading it like I'm blowing through the morning news or something like that. The point of that reading, I think one of the first things it takes but in Latin is otium. It takes a kind of leisure, right? So first of all, it takes an ability to just not be rushed, at least in part. But it also just takes an openness to realizing that I understand how to read, in the sense of the mechanics of reading. I know subject and verb and those kinds of things, but part of the reading process is paying attention to what's the relationship of these words to each other. And so the way I approach the daily office and the reading part is to, first of all, make sure I'm not just trying to squeak it in between other things. And, and this is not, I'm not saying I have this figured out, like I could obviously spend more time reading in the office and those kinds of things. But most I'm expecting the ability that I can sit down, I can read, and because these words aren't just mere words conveying meaning, but they're words that God is using to convey himself to us, that I need to prepare myself to hear those words differently than just like parts of speech, and instead to think like what is behind that. What is the Lord, and not like unlock it as if I need to do some sort of historical critical methodology, but just like what is the meaning of this word for me today. So mostly what I want to do is not domesticate the words, kind of like, well, I know what these words mean, but instead like I know, I do know how to read, but I need God to kind of show me the meaning of these words at this given moment in my life, and in the context of the liturgy too. So it's not so overly personalized that I need God to speak to me, but like, how do these words work in salvation history? How do these words work, as in the church today, being part of that salvation history? So I think I think maybe another way is like reading it with a kind of leisurely pace and ability, but also like expecting more from it than you would expect from the words of a novel or something like that.
I love reading through there, and I do this with the Latin, and I do this with the King James English. There's I almost like sometimes, how does a phrase sound? What is, there's even the words, and I try to read over it, and you savor, you want to see, because I think both the words and the way they're put together, as well as their meaning, oftentimes can bring a sort of contemplation.
Yeah, in our lectionary this morning, or maybe it was yesterday, the psalm was, Psalm 40, which goes something like, "I waited patiently for the Lord," in the opening verse. Now, if you're a U2 fan, you have to, first of all, you got to get the U2 song out of your head. That's literally the first couple of verses of that song, called 40. And but I waited patiently for the Lord. I mean, if you just, again, patiently read that, and then you realize like there's something interesting about like waiting almost implies a kind of patient, right? I mean, but then my experience is actually that I don't wait very well, especially like at the dentist's office, if you will. Like, why did we have an agreed upon time if you're not going to be ready at that time? Why am I here wasting my time? So getting past that sense of that, I'm an impatient person, even in my waiting for most things, and thinking like, what is the psalmist saying there? Like, it's not the opposite of just going to the dentist and being more patient with the dentist. It's richer than that in the psalm. And, so you have to have time to ruminate on that, to think about that. And if you're doing the reading part too quickly or praying the office too quickly, which sometimes is necessary or happens, you're probably going to miss out. But that's the great thing about, as the lectionary in the office is you're going to come back around to it in due time. So the Lord's going to give you another opportunity to think about it. So,
yeah, I always loved that. I remember when I was in France, I realized that patience and perseverance were two sides of the same coin. Patience was waiting, perseverance is continuing to go. Both of them were,
interesting. Yeah.
But so the other side of that is the one of the great monastic tools is silence. And I realize that's a precious commodity of someone who doesn't actually live in a monastery. But what role, I mean, how do you understand silence in your prayer life?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, yeah, because you're right. It's very hard to come by. And for lots of different reasons. So I think there's a couple of elements to silence. I mean, obviously the on the nose understanding of silence would just be the lack of sound, or at least the minimalization of sound. And I think that there is a huge importance to that kind of silence. When you can find it, cherish it. But then there's also just the kind of silence that I would forget what spiritual author this is, and I mean, maybe it's even someone as awesome as John Cashin or something like that. I can't remember, but like, just because there's no sound doesn't mean that a person is silent before the Lord, right? And so I think silence is not just the absence of something, it's the presence of something. And that would be, and this is where I like the word like Hezekiah from the Greek tradition, right? There's maybe a stillness associated with silence, and that you might be able to get rid of all the noise around you, but that doesn't mean your internal state is going to be still before the Lord to be able to hear that silence. But I think if you don't try to remove the noise, you really can't get to even remotely maybe thinking about stillness at that point. I mean, I really don't think that we as Christians really can not have silence and think that we can have the kind of intimacy that we desire with the Lord. And so part of what I think is important in the daily office in particular, and this is where monks do this, right? Like, so Benedict says that the silence after a psalm or prayer should not be any longer than necessary. But the main thing there is to say, but there is a silence after those things, right? There is a moment to stop and not just reflect, but again, to kind of be there before the Lord. And so silence has to function that. So I try to build in some silence into my daily office. I'm at a point, my youngest is now 19. And so I don't have little kids running around anymore. And he's mostly out of I'm up before him, but he's out of the house before, us most mornings. So we do have a bit of silence. But then if I think about it, I live in the greater Los Angeles area. I haven't heard silence since I've moved here. Like I don't hear the cars anymore, but they're always there. And so, but if I don't try to remove as much of the extraneous sounds, I think then I'm not doing silence well. But again, I want to just emphasize again that alone is not sufficient. You've got to also be able to move into a place where you're still before the Lord. Be still and know that I am God. And so for me, silence is essential. And I am dispositionally wired to not want to be talked at a lot. Like that's my kind of personality and all. But at the same time, that's not the same either as real monastic silence, as you know. I mean, monastic
Right.
silence is, speaking when you only absolutely have to. And again, it's stilling yourself in that silence.
One of the things I think about silence is that silence is not an absence. Yes, people think of silence as being a lack of sound, and there is a truth to that. But as you very, very correctly pointed out, you can be in a silent environment where there's no sound around you, and not be silent at all because your mind is going and what have you. So physical silence does not equal spiritual silence. But I've always thought about it's kind of like Thomas Aquinas's, evil is not something; it is the absence of good. Silence, prayerful silence, you could say monastic, really is prayerful silence is when the mind, you are able to cut through the distractions and focus on what you're thinking about, which is God. So to be able to, muse over what you've read, to be able to muse over and lift up to God and say, okay, what does this mean? And the ability to, monicate, being alone, having a single thought, which is God, or being able to push out of your head unnecessary. And you're right. Sometimes there are things you're doing that don't allow you to have that singleness of thought, but to have it there, have it present as often as possible, and to um, use it to cut through other distractions or things you know things that are going to come pest you and demand your attention, and to say no, I'm going to um, if I don't have something to do right now, or I'm going to have this this dialogue with God, or this meditation going on in my head, as often as I can. And I like to think of that as silence, because again, what monastic silence is designed to do is to make it easier for you to fill your mind with the things of God, the readings, the readings of the scriptures, the readings of the Psalms, um, and this, if it lowers distractions. But this, you can also, as you pointed out, you can still learn and work at focusing your mind on not being as distracted. Yes, if you have work to do, if you do the work, but have it in the back, have it right there and right behind whatever you're doing. And when you have time or in between, is to go back to your meditations and don't get distracted. And I realize with the phones and everything else, it's very easy to do. But and I always like to think of silence not as being an absence of sound, but as being a filling your head with the simplicity of God and the going back to God in your mind and not because again you can actually have interior silence, as you said, hesychasm, the Greek word for peaceful stillness. You can have that in the middle of a city.
Yes. Yep. Exactly. And I was struck recently by, most offices will begin maybe after an opening sentence with like, "Oh Lord, open our lips."
Hmm.
Right. So there's an interesting thought there, right? Like the assumption would be, as my lips have been closed, and now, Lord, open my lips to speak forth these prayers. So there's an implication there, I think, of a kind of actual silence before the Lord that then culminates in the opening of our lips and the consecrating of ourselves to this time of prayer. And to your point too, Gregory, is like, we also know that the monk, the idea of monk is one who is alone. If I go to Walmart, just to pick a notoriously busy place, if I go to Walmart by myself to do some shopping, I mean, in one sense, I'm alone, but I'm alone in the middle of all these people. I just don't know them.
Nobody cares
Right?
about you. No one's going to interact with you. You're right.
Exactly. So there's a way to just like be alone without being alone. I think there's a way to be silent without it being silent, physically silent all around you. And I would say that's the primary thing. I think they're related. I mean, these people that say, "Oh, I can ignore my phone or I can do that." It's like, well, you probably aren't doing that actually. The fact that you don't want to silence it tells me that But again, we don't need to mistake, like you say, the physical silence for a kind of like proper prayerful silence. Those are related, but yet two different things. And obviously, the more important silence is that the ultimate silence of prayerful silence before the Lord.
Do you think there's anything physical involved or necessary in the prayer life, or keeping the spirit of prayer, the prayer life?
Absolutely. I mean, I think like, it's kind of like, why is it that when I try to read any kind of a book on the sofa, it's like immediately my body is like, "Why are you so tired?" you know. But yeah, if I sit here in this, not terribly uncomfortable, but not terribly comfortable office chair, with these lights above me and all, why is it so much easier to kind of stay alert and to read even for hours at a time? And so I think in prayer, like part of it is like, well, prayer, I'm coming before the King of the universe, so I probably shouldn't be like casually kicking back on my lounge or whatever,
Right.
but also like, if you're kind of a stickler for rubrics, also, it'll tell you when to stand and sit and kneel. So I think posture is hugely important. And I think this is, coming back to hesychasm, the 14th century Orthodox hesychast, like Gregory Palamas and his master, Gregory of Sinai, they were called the navel gazers because they adopted a sitting posture that would be amenable to that kind of stillness and silence before the Lord. And apparently that posture involved them looking down towards their navel. So we would be used to that posture, maybe thinking it's some sort of an Eastern religion, but it's there in Eastern Orthodox Christianity as well. But again, like the wisdom of that monastic tradition would say there's a wisdom into the posture of how you pray. And I think, yeah, the embodiment of prayer is a huge part of it as well. And, it's proper to get on your knees and confess your sins if you're able to. I mean, there's something about feeling the hardwood or something under the floor. I mean, I think of, every time I'm at the Shoda house, and those stalls are a little tight, depending on where you're seated. And then you get down on your knees, and I don't know what it is, but something about the Shoda house reminds me how much my knees don't like being on the hard floor. I can do it a lot easier other places for some odd reason. But anyway, the point of all that is to say, like, but I kind of wouldn't trade that right? It's a good part of the prayer. So yeah, so I would encourage the listeners to say, like, try to make prayer as embodied as possible. I've also taken to just praying midday prayer when I can, walking. Um, both because I think there's a wisdom to just being on my feet and doing it as opposed to doing it. And of course, I live in a place where it's mostly sunny all the time, and so but also just like that willingness to stand up and kind of walk and have a posture that's different than sitting. I think is an important one. So yeah, I think we should encourage that. And then again, if you're someone leading the daily office, rubrics matter. So do the rubrics.
Yes, you can, definitely.
Yeah, exactly.
Question of language. I know traditionally the prayers were done in Latin. That's moved away to in English now, and the difference. How important do you think the kind of language, or how important how important do you think language is in its absolute sense in prayer?
Yeah, I think quite important, actually. Not so much as in Latin versus English, let's say, but in the way I address God, it is important what my language is. They, there's a running joke. Maybe it started as a meme or a joke or something. I don't know, but like that basically, Instagram is for illiterate people and Twitter is for barely educated people. Because you don't even need to use words on Instagram. It's just pictures, but there is a sense of the lessening of the formality of language that's happened. And I think our prayer language shouldn't be elevated for pretentious reasons. It should be elevated because we're in communion with the God of the universe in a particular way at that moment. And so I think our language should comport to this. And the good news is, for those of us who are Anglicans and praying from the prayer book does a lot of that for us already. It is adjudicated what words are good words to use in relationship for what we're requesting. But nonetheless, this general movement within kind of low church Protestantism of like God's a dude or whatever, it's just like I mean, first of all, I find that just casual to the point of irreverent. So I am a fan of using proper language. I mean, again, not necessarily a King's English versus contemporary idiom, but reminding ourselves that I expect my students, because I'm a professor, I expect my students when they come in the room, it's Dr. Peters, they're not going to greet me as like, what's up, dude? They're going to say, oh, hello, Dr. Peters, and I will show them respect by using their name too, and not referring to, what's up, you, or whatever. And so I think with the way, if I'm going to do that and expect that for myself, like how much more proper language for the Lord.
Right.
And again, I find myself, and this, and Bernard of Clairvaux, right? They say like one of the hardest things to do with Bernard of Clairvaux is to try to, annotate his works in the sense of like, here's where he's quoting scripture, because Bernard just came to a point where he thought in the language of scripture. And so the words just came out and he wasn't always intentionally referring to the Pauline text. And I think there is something to that in our prayer life, especially those of us that are Anglicans, is the more you're formed in prayer book prayer, the more you'll pray in those terms, just in general. And I think that's totally a good thing. And I try to encourage people not to, even at my parish, if we extemporize in the prayers of the people in places where we're allowed to, I try to, if I hear someone being a little too casual, I'll try to pastorally gently encourage them to elevate that because of the context. Yeah.
Got you. Final question. You mentioned Bernard of Clairvaux. How important do you think it is to look into commentaries or read other people's opinions of scripture to be able to better get into prayer, as opposed to just reading the text and kind of listening to God?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, monastics have tended historically to do a bit of both. Matter of fact, just this morning I was was reading Rupert of Deutz, a good kind of 12th century monastic theologian, and Rupert is basically saying like, don't be so simple. And simple there, simpliciter is probably a synonym for don't be so humble that you're unwilling to read the fathers on the scriptures. So he's not talking about, well, first of all, there is no Thomas Aquinas yet. He's not talking about going and reading scholastic theology. But hey, don't be so humble that you think you can't learn from the fathers. But primarily, apart from the office of readings, mostly it was the scriptures. And so I actually think the default for me starting place is like read the scriptures, like be open to the Lord, meditate on them, ruminate on them. Now this would be, in personal prayer, right? If you're sermonizing or something, no one needs to hear your idiosyncratic take on the text, and mostly good preachers, pastors always want to be teaching and preaching with the continuity of the tradition, not against it, So, I tend to read commentaries and all very, very, not so much modern commentaries, but the fathers or the medievals on the text, because I want to kind of preach with them, not against them or contrary to what they've said historically. But I think there could be an overemphasis on reading what others have thought about it, and then you're more valuing what has been said about the text than the scriptures themselves. And so I do think there's a balance there, but primarily I would say start with the text. And if this is the umpteenth time you've reflected on a psalm or a reading in the daily office, and you're still you find yourself going, oh, I'm still perplexed by that, then yeah, sure, go and read a commentary on that. Try to, I don't know, Paul in 1 Corinthians 15, that baptism for the dead bit that I don't fully understand, there, if you want to, and you should, if you want to make that part of your meditative life, you might need a little bit more of a sense of like what's going on there. So yeah, go read someone trusted on that. But yeah, so it's, again, you used the image of a coin earlier. I think it's the two sides of the same coin. But the scriptures, not just because they're inspired, but they should have priority, I think. But but we can certainly read the fathers for great benefit.
Right. I think that's one of the things that I found most, because being Roman Catholic, it's the Rosary, and it's much more rote prayers that are said almost like, I got 3 rosaries in today. It's like 3 rosaries in the bank, where I really appreciated the spirit, the Anglican spirituality of reading and meditating, and kind of like nourishing the interior garden more so than getting money in the bank. And I think that the monastic spirituality is, you're not in a hurry to get anywhere. You're kind of enjoying the journey, so to speak. You're taking your time. You're reading. You're praying. You're meditating, and you're trying to keep yourself close to God. Any final thoughts from you, Father?
Just, I was going to say, the final thing there is like, that's a great way to think, like going back to like kind of the monastic daily office, and the way that Anglicans mimic that is to just say, like, the goal isn't mastery of the biblical text. The goal is communion with God. And so again, like that's to pick up on your journey language. Like every opportunity for prayer is a step on the journey, not an attempt to get to the goal. Because that's ultimately eschatological anyway. So.
Excellent, Father. Well, thank you very much for your time.
Yeah,
and
great to be with you.
God bless you, and I'll talk to you soon.
All right. Thank you, Father.
All right.